Greetings once more. This is Jerry Roberts, and we're going to continue looking at our different, what you'd call cross-cultural adjustment tensions. We just finished up discussing time, and I always like starting with time because it's one of the ones that's easiest to see and explain, kind of sets up the platform for the discussion of the rest of these different challenges that we face. The second one actually is one of the most challenging to understand. You really can't fully understand it until you're finally someday sitting in a discussion with someone who holds the different view than you do. But I'm going to try to introduce it anyway. It's considered tensions regarding judgment. Tensions regarding judgment have to do with the differences between a holistic view of life and a holistic view of people and what's called a dichotomistic view of people. A holistic view means looking at the whole person, their whole life, the whole situation, seeing everything as one big ball of that there is no connections and such. Dichotomistic, once again, meaning two, dichotomistic is a way of viewing people and things and situations and challenges, seeing things broken up into little boxes and treating each box in its own separate compartment. And so it's a difference between looking at the whole and looking at things in compartments. The real difference is between a Hebraic, African, and Arab worldview versus a Greco-European worldview. Most of the people in Africa, the Arab world, some parts of the Far East have this holistic view, and it's important for us to understand this holistic view because the holistic view is what we also find in most of Scripture. That's one of the reasons it's important to understand this. Whereas the dichotomistic view is more of the Greco-European. It's the view that many people in America maintain. It's a very logic-based, very structured, very breaking things down into its constituent parts to look at it. And once again, it's different from the two-thirds world or the majority world versus the Western world. The two-thirds world tends to have more of a holistic view. The Western world tends to have more of a dichotomistic view. And once again, it's a way of looking at it. Do you look at things integrated all as all these different parts making a whole, or do you compartmentalize things to look at them? And even in just this introduction, you can already see that if you're a person like me, I read those things on the right side. I read that idea of compartmentalization, and I think that's the way people ought to think. I think that's the way it ought to be. How can you view the whole all at once? You got to break it down in its little boxes, okay? So you can see our minds tend to be programmed with a tendency toward either a holistic view or a tendency toward a compartmentalized or dichotomistic view. So once again, we'll look real quick at our continuum. And, you can see there, this is not a yes-no question. This is a continuum. There are people groups and cultures that tend more toward holistic views. There are people groups and cultures that tend toward a more dichotomistic view. And there's lots of places in between. Now, I didn't really fill out the ones in between because this is a very difficult one to nail down. It's difficult to say exactly where people fall. It's pretty clear that Middle Easterners and most Far Easterners tend to be holistic. Most people in USA and Europe tend to be dichotomistic. But there's a lot of middle out there available for many different other people groups and cultures, and it all depends on where they land on how they view judgment and how they view people and the situations that we face. So what are some of the differences? Let's first look at the holistic view. A holistic view, the whole sees the whole as greater than the sum of its parts. A holistic view says that you can't just break something down into its little pieces and say that by understanding the pieces you can understand the whole. They might talk about the issue of a puzzle, and when the puzzle is all broken down to its little parts, it's very difficult to look at each little part. You might not even be able to tell by looking at individual parts. How would you ever know what the whole picture is? Whereas when you put all the puzzle pieces together, you're able to see the whole. You can see the whole picture. And so when it comes to understanding situations or circumstances or people and their lives, they want to look at the whole rather than the little parts. And as I said, this is not an easy one to understand. Don't get worried if you don't understand it yet. We'll try to clarify it a little bit as we go forward here. It's interesting because holistic people also, when it comes to education and how you learn, they tend to follow an issue of sight reading, memorization, and apprenticeship. Learning is all about memorizing what is written, memorizing what is passed down from the elders, passed down from the past. Sight reading, it's being able to understand things as they are seen right there. Apprenticeship, you serve under a person who understands better than you do, and you learn from those in the past. And so this holistic view tends to emphasize that type of education. The holistic view of a person, who you are on the whole, is more important than specific actions. Who you are on the whole, and I just noticed I have terrible spelling errors on this particular thing, and I apologize for that. Please ignore the spelling errors. Now that I've mentioned them to you, you can't see anything but the spelling errors. But who you are on the whole is more important than specific actions. For instance, David is listed in Scripture as a man after God's own heart. Now, when we look at it from the dichotomistic view here in a minute, you'll see that this is a place that we really see the difference. Matter of fact, I'm just going to skip ahead and run through the dichotomistic view real quick so you can see the clear differences. Whereas the holistic sees the whole as greater than the parts, dichotomistic has a tendency toward reductionism. We tend to want to break everything down into smaller pieces and squeeze those smaller pieces into yes-no questions, into black-white decisions, and be able to say, if this is true, then that can't be true. If this is false, then that can't be false. So it's reductionism. It's breaking it down. It's measuring everything in its own little box, and once you check off all the boxes, then you know you've got the issue solved. So you can see that that's how dichotomistic thinking works. And you can see how a person who is a dichotomistic thinker thinks a holistic thinker is nuts, and a holistic thinker thinks a dichotomistic thinker is simplistic. And we have that discussion even in the U.S. We have people who are more holistic, people who are more dichotomistic. As I've said before, neither of them are right and neither of them are wrong. Both of them have tendencies that could lead toward poor decisions and could lead toward negative results. Both of them have tendencies that can lead toward good outcomes and good results. So it's not a good versus bad in any of these. Every one of these has, taken to their extremes, are not going to do well. But I'm not talking about good, bad here. I'm talking about you understanding that there are other people on this planet who, when they see an issue, they think about it differently than you do, and getting used to that reality. Whereas holistic people tend to go through memorization and apprenticeship. Dichotomistic, we tend to have conceptual learning. We teach people to question things. Now, holistic, you don't question things. You memorize what is. Conceptual learning, we tell people to question things. Question I encourage questions. I encourage you to write me emails and say, hey, what about this? You didn't answer that. Or we encourage questioning, which I consider one of the strengths of a dichotomistic worldview. Its weakness is its tendency to reduce things down to these little boxes and therefore think you can come up with simple answers to things. A holistic person has a better understanding that a complicated issue is going to have a complicated answer. A dichotomist tends to look for simple answers to the individual pieces. Dichotomistic people tend to look for formulas for success. If you do A, B, and C, you're going to have success. Dichotomistic view of people are and their identity are determined by specific actions and events. And once again, I just got through saying that holistic view says who you are on the whole is more important than specific actions. But this says people and their identity are determined by their specific action and events. And once again, we're looking at the issue of David. A holistic view, a Hebraic view of David was a good man, a man after God's own heart. A dichotomistic view, especially, once again, I tend to be very dichotomistic in my thinking. It's something I have to argue against and fight against in my own life to keep from being too much this way. But I say, how could David be a man after God's own heart? Man, he committed adultery. He had 77 wives or something, a bunch of concubines. And then he committed adultery. I was saying, you got all these wives, what you commit adultery for? But anyway, that's a totally different issue. And then after that, he had a guy killed. And after that, he wasn't a good father. He raised his kids in a way that they were fighting against each other, eventually led to a civil war. What do you mean David was a man after God's heart? Look at all the things he failed at. And so a dichotomistic view looks at David's life and puts a box of good and a box of bad and says, check, 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 no, 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 I'm not sure if David was really a man after God's own heart or not. A holistic view said, yes, but every time he failed, he repented. Every time he got prideful, he turned back to God. Every time and so a holistic view, a Hebraic view of David is he was a man after God's own heart. A dichotomist, and we do that to other people as well. The year that I'm making these particular videos is the year that the issue of the cancel culture became very, very a hot topic. And if you're watching this years in the future, I don't know if you will understand the cancel culture. Go back, look up cancel culture 2020, whatever you want to do if you don't remember this. But the cancel culture. And the cancel culture is highly dichotomistic. It's really interesting because some of the people who live in this cancel culture world tend to think of themselves as holistic thinkers, but when it comes to these issues, they're incredibly dichotomistic. Cancel culture says, you can live a good life, do good things, give money to the poor, treat people well, be on our side on all of these issues, these social issues that we're in favor of. But then we find out that at one point, you one time dressed up in a costume for Halloween that was offensive. Now, I know you were only 17 years old or 18 years old, but that shows that you are a bad person at heart, and you should be canceled. You can no longer be considered a good person because of this one bad thing you did. Okay? Dichotomistic thinkers have a tendency to do that. We tend to take in singular events and create a whole judgment out of them, rather than looking at a person's life in a whole and say, no, for the most part they were good. They did some stupid stuff. By the way, we all do stupid stuff. But they were redeemed. And to tell you the truth, in this particular thing, Christianity needs to be more holistic than dichotomistic. Man, we've got to forgive. We've got to let people have a life, a holistic view of life where we see the grace of God at work in people's lives. Now, that doesn't mean that you take a person who has done something terrible and put them right back in a position of leadership. It doesn't mean that if a person has done something terrible to you or in your life, that you once again forgive them and give them power in your life that allows them to harm you again. Those are different issues. But if we can see in the long term that the grace of God has worked in a person's life, we can say, man, on the whole, God's grace won out in their life. And so anyway, that's just one little way of viewing this dichotomistic, holistic idea as we view it in the world of a people life. One other comparison, just a way of looking at how people dichotomistic view and holistic view would be the AIDS epidemic in Africa. Okay, the dichotomistic view, once again, the view that I would have a tendency to follow, we would tend to look at the AIDS epidemic in Latvia and in Africa, and we would say, okay, we got to put each thing in its own separate box. We've got this box that is the spiritual issues. We got another box that's the scientific issues. We got another box that's the social issues. Another box that's the economic issues. And we would go through and say, how do we solve these economic issues? How do we solve these scientific issues? How do we solve the social issues? And then we say, we add all these little boxes up together and say, we do this for this, this for this, this for this, this for this. And then if we do all these things, it'll solve the problem. A holistic view would say, what are all the implications and all the following parts for the whole? There's a spiritual and scientific mixture, and how do they affect the whole? The social and economic. How does that affect the whole? How do we solve the whole problem? We can't just solve one problem because it's not going to solve the whole problem. We have to solve the whole problem. And as I said, I can't really even explain to you well enough to see how this way. Just understand. If you tend to be a person with a holistic view, understand there are people whose brains operate on a dichotomistic view. If you tend to be on a dichotomistic view, understand that there are people in this world, and a lot of them, who have a holistic view and cannot just break things down into little boxes and think that we're solving things. So, as I said, as we're making these personal adjustments, as we're making these, realizing the differences is the first step toward being able to find a way to personally adjust in a meaningful way and be able to find a way to become the kind of people who can be a blessing to others in our cross-cultural ministry.